Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that's equal parts battlefield grit, candlelit secrets, and the kind of midnight whispers that generals would rather you didn't write down in the official war reports. Because, let's be honest, nobody drafts a dispatch back to the king saying, "Yes, we took the town, but also, Your Majesty, you won't believe who I had in my tent last night." Our tale opens not in some glamorous palace, but in the mud-churned camps of the 30 Years' War. You know, the kind of place where boots sink ankle-deep, ale tastes suspiciously like rainwater, and the only entertainment is dice games and listening to some old mercenary complain about his gout. And yet, in that chaos, there was always a flicker of something forbidden. The women who moved through the night like shadows, camp followers, healers, spies, and sometimes mistresses. And one of them, our focus tonight, earned herself a name whispered with equal parts reverence and scandal, the Mistress of Midnight. No, that wasn't her real name. Soldiers are dramatic like that. But the title stuck because she seemed to appear only after dusk, slipping between tents when the campfires burned low. Her footsteps soft, as if the mud itself conspired to keep her secret. She wasn't some common distraction either, the Strafil. She had a particular soldier she visited, a hardened captain whose scars were more numerous than his victories, a man who had lost too much to ever let himself feel softness again. And yet, when she entered his tent, the war stopped, at least for a little while. So let's walk into that camp together. Let's lower our voices, pull the tent flap aside, and see exactly what unfolded when war's brutality met desire's persistence. Because sometimes, the strangest thing about history isn't the battles, it's what people did when the swords finally went quiet for the night. Alia, all right. So picture it. The camp had just settled into that strange, uneasy quiet. You know the kind. Fires reduced to embers. The dice games finally ending when someone either lost too much coin or lost too much patience, and the groans of the wounded fading into a low background hum. Soldiers slept with one hand on their swords, just in case, because in this war, the enemy wasn't the only one you had to watch out for. And there he was, Captain Roderick. Don't worry, I promise not to recycle names endlessly like I'm running some kind of historical soap opera. So you're safe from another Kyros or Darius. Roderick was broad-shouldered, prematurely gray at the temples, and carried himself like a man who had seen too many winters on campaign. His tent was larger than most, privilege of rank, but it was still just canvas, mud-stained boots tossed by the flap, and a cot that looked about as comfortable as a coffin lid. Conk, he was polishing his sword by candlelight, not because he needed it gleaming, but because that's what men like him did when sleep refused to come. His hands, scarred and strong, moved mechanically, until he heard the softest sound outside. Not the crunch of boots, not the heavy gait of a soldier, but the whisper of skirts brushing against the ground. He tensed, fingers curling around the hilt. But then, the tent flap stirred, and in she slipped. No name announced, no excuse given, just her, the Mistress of Midnight. Dark cloak around her shoulders, hair catching the candlelight, eyes that held more mischief than fear. "Oh, Captain," she whispered, like the title itself was a caress. And just like that, the sword in his hand suddenly felt unnecessary. He set it down, though his jaw remained tight, his voice gruff. "You shouldn't be here." "Of course," she smiled. "Because that's exactly what people say when they want someone to stay but can't quite admit it." She stepped closer, her fingers grazing the edge of his desk, trailing over maps and dispatches as if testing how far she could push. "The war doesn't stop," she said softly, "but you could." For a moment, and that was the trap. Not swords, not bullets, but temptation wrapped in silk and shadow. Lalian. So Roderick leaned back in his wooden chair, arms crossed, and tried to maintain that imperious captain's composure. You know the one, like he'd never once been caught off guard. But of course, she wasn't here to admire the maps. Not really. She had other maps in mind, the contours of his patience, the borders of his self-control, and the unspoken lines of desire he didn't yet realize he'd drawn himself. She circled the tent slowly, almost cat-like. Every movement measured, deliberate, like she knew exactly how far to come close without overstepping. One step too far and he could have grabbed her, thrown her out. One step too short and she wouldn't have provoked anything at all. And that, my friends, is the art of midnight seduction in a war camp. Shh. The thrill comes from knowing the other person can, and might, end it instantly. Why are you here? Roderick finally asked, voice low but tense, the kind that made you lean forward involuntarily. 还挺开始的，听不听? She stopped by the edge of the cot, her hands brushing over the rough blanket, and glanced up. Because, she said slowly, drawing out the word like it was both a threat and a promise, you need to remember that not everything in this camp is measured in victories and losses. Some things are measured in moments. And suddenly, the world outside, the blood, the dirt, the groaning of the wounded, faded into background noise. It was just her and him, tent walls soaked with candlelight, shadows flickering like whispers, the faint tang of smoke mixing with the scent of leather and sweat. Yeah? She leaned in closer, careful not to touch, just enough for him to feel the heat radiating from her. His fingers itched, but he didn't move. That was the thing about her. She commanded restraint without force. She whispered, voice like silk drawn across a blade, would you rather chase glory or savor it for just one night? And he realized, just like that he'd been caught. Not by her words, not by her presence, but by the promise she carried, the kind of temptation that made a seasoned captain reconsider strategies he'd followed for decades. And so the game began. Every step she took was calculated. Every glance, every pause, every soft inhale was an invitation and a challenge all at once. And Roderick? Well, he learned very quickly that sometimes the fiercest battle is fought not with swords, but with whispered words and deliberate silences. The night had thickened by the time she returned to the tent, carrying a single lantern that threw trembling light against the canvas walls. Roderick was already there, sitting on the edge of the cot, boots kicked off, armor pieces scattered like broken promises. He didn't look at her at first. Not because he wasn't aware, but because he knew once he did, reason would abandon him entirely. She closed the flap softly behind her and paused. For a heartbeat, nothing moved except the candle flame, dancing in a quiet rhythm that seemed to mimic the quickening beat of their own hearts. She stepped closer. Merkin, not enough to touch, not yet, but close enough that he could feel her warmth. Smell her hair curling faintly with the scent of lavender and smoke. He exhaled sharply. One of those almost inaudible sighs that betray restraint. Do you always command this much attention? He asked, voice low, teasing, but there was an edge there he tried to hide like a blade under cloth. She smirked, lips curling with the kind of mischievous patience that could drive a man to ruin. Only the men who deserve it, she whispered, letting her fingers hover just above his arm. The air between them thickened. Every soldier in the camp, every plan, every battle felt distant and inconsequential. Here, in this tent, time was hers to manipulate, and then she did it. The slightest graze of her fingertips along the line of his forearm, enough to send heat blooming like wildfire, but not enough to fully ignite it. His hand twitched, almost reaching for her, but he held back, because that was the danger, the thrill. She was both promise and peril. He leaned forward, the shadow of his face moving closer to hers, almost daring her to speak. And she did. Softly but pointedly, I wonder, do you always fight battles this way? Cool? He swallowed, caught somewhere between a laugh and a growl. Depends, he said, words husky, laced with tension, on whether the battlefield is in the open or behind closed tent flaps. Her eyes gleamed in the candlelight, dark, knowing, and utterly untouchable. and then, just briefly, deliberately, her hand brushed against his chest, tracing the edge of his tunic with just enough pressure to make him inhale sharply. We'll search, not a full embrace, not a kiss, but the kind of touch that promised more, if he dared. The night stretched between them, the silence but anticipation, but sweet and dangerous. And Roderick, the unflinching captain, realized in that heartbeat that this was a battle he might lose. And maybe, for the first time, he didn't mind. For first time, the tent was quiet now, save for the occasional scrape of armor from the discarded pieces at the corner. Outside, the camp was alive with the distant rumble of fire and muffled shouts, soldiers unaware of the drama unfolding in the small canvas sanctuary. Inside, it was just them, two people bound by circumstance, desire, and the dangerous thrill of stolen moments. She stepped closer, letting her hand rest lightly on the edge of the table where his sword lay. Not touching him yet, just near enough that the warmth of her skin seemed to pull at him. Roderick's gaze followed every subtle movement, aware that each tilt of her head, every flicker of her eyes, was a calculated strategy in a game far more dangerous than any skirmish he had ever fought. "You know," she murmured, voice soft, almost a whisper meant only for him. "I've always wondered what it feels like to have someone truly watch you, to really notice, beyond the armor, beyond the ranks, beyond the stories others tell." He swallowed, heart hammering in a way that surprised even him. "And do I?" he asked, his voice rough but intimate, catching on the edges of her words. "Notice you?" Her smile was slow, teasing a curve of lips that promised more than she would ever give freely. "I think you do," she said, letting her fingertips brush lightly along the hilt of his sword. The metal vibrated slightly under her touch, echoing like a heartbeat between them. "And yet, you're careful. Always careful. Even when the world is gone, even when no one else can see." He shifted forward, drawn in the tension coiling tight in his chest. His hands hovered, uncertain, betraying a restraint that was both infuriating and intoxicating. "You think I can resist?" he murmured, words barely escaping, laden with something dangerous. "I think you might try," she said, stepping closer until the space between them was minimal, just the width of a single breath. "But I also think you'd rather not," and there it was, the unspoken truth hovering in the air. Desire, temptation, a near kiss that could ignite everything in a single motion. Yet they lingered in the precipice, savoring the anticipation, letting the tension stretch until it was almost unbearable. Roderick's hand twitched toward hers, almost brushing, almost touching, but she held back, letting him ache for the contact, savoring the power of her restraint. Their eyes locked, both daring, both vulnerable, both aware that in this stolen moment, the battlefield outside didn't exist, and all that mattered was the slow, heady pull between them. And in that quiet, suspended second, they both understood their nights would never be the same again. And neither of them would dare look away. The campfires burned lower now, casting long, flickering shadows across the ground, the smell of smoke mingling with the metallic tang of blood, and the earthy scent of trampled earth. Most of the soldiers had retired to their tents, exhausted from the day's drills and skirmishes, leaving the night to its own secrets. And inside one particular canvas enclosure, the air was thick, not with fear, though that always lingered, but with something far more dangerous, anticipation. Elora stepped inside, her boots silent against the coarse matting, eyes scanning the small, dimly lit tent. He was already there, sitting on the furs, chest rising and falling steadily, but the tension coiled in him, palpable, electric. The flickering lamp caught the edge of his jaw, highlighting the faint scars that traced his history. A history of battles fought and victories taken, yet here he was, vulnerable in ways no enemy had ever seen. "You came," he said, voice low. Almost a growl, eyes never leaving hers. "Oh, I always do," she replied, letting her hand hover near his shoulder, testing him, teasing him, the quiet intimacy of proximity a game in itself. He could feel her presence like a weight pressing gently, demanding attention, commanding it without force. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered her hand, letting it rest on his arm. The roughness of his skin contrasted with the softness of her touch, sending a shiver up his spine. Roderick's hands, normally so steady on a blade, trembled slightly as they hovered. Roderick's hung, uncertain whether to move or remain suspended in the torment of the near touch. "Tut, I've watched you," she whispered, voice honeyed and dangerous, "through drills, through battles, through the laughter of others who think they know you, and I've learned something." Her lips curved faintly, the kind of smile that promised both comfort and chaos. "Even the strongest men can burn under the right touch." He swallowed hard, chest tightening. Every instinct screamed caution, every lesson, every hardened habit. But the pull was undeniable. He leaned forward slightly, just enough that the heat from his body brushed against hers. She didn't retreat. Instead, she let the contact linger, a teasing prelude, a dangerous dance neither could fully resist. "반주타자." Her fingers slid along the curve of his arm, tracing scars as if reading a history only she was permitted to know. "You fight for the crown, for your men, for honor. But do you fight for this?" she asked softly, tilting her head, eyes gleaming in the low light. "For the fire that's right here waiting?" Roderick's breath hitched. His hand found hers, almost, but she shifted, letting the anticipation build. It was cruel, yes, but deliberate. Every second stretched out like the taut string of a bow, threatening to snap, threatening to explode. Finally. He caught her hand fully, fingers entwining, the warmth spreading through him like liquid fire. She leaned in, her lips brushing his ear, whispering words that were both a promise and a warning. Once this begins, there's no battlefield that can stop it. And then, just like that, they were no longer two people merely in a tent. They were a storm contained, a dangerous force in the dark, knowing each movement, each whispered word, each stolen breath would tie them closer than any chain, closer than any army's order. The night stretched before them, endless, and they were ready to burn together, every moment a risk, every touch a surrender. Ew.